Mission: to create and deliver wellness training and comprehensive sex ed to schools, to provide digital tools and resources to survivors of sexual trauma and wellness training to all participants, and to offer live events and creative programs that will heal and empower through the magic of psalm, or voice, sound, song, and hymn. Psalm is a noun, a sacred song, sound, hymn, or a poem.
Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And yes, thank you for the lively music. It's so invigorating to be in community and to have an inspiring influence. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about challenges in how we're educating our youth and some of the systemic barriers that prevent both victims and the survivors who are seeking justice from getting full support. And part of what motivates me is the research that I did as the CEO and co-founder of a think tank called FEM Inc. So the mission of FEM Inc. Is, as you probably guessed, incubating feminine power. And it's all around the different ways in which systemic barriers prevent full and equal opportunities for women. And we looked at a number of things. We look at gender bias in media, in technology, and popular culture. We also look at it in algorithms. So one of the studies we recently completed was with Google as a partner, a funding partner, and we analyzed the role that digital ads play in perpetuating certain types of bias. Let me just take this off. There we go. And what was interesting was that we found that digital ads, you see a banner ad, right? You go to a website, you see an ad. They often use women's bodies as, a gimmick, a novelty, a way to get people to click. And what we found was just one exposure of an ad that objectified or sexualized a woman, and in particular those ads that were for products that had nothing to do with anything sexual, led to a direct and immediate increase in benevolent sexism in young men in the workforce. One exposure. That plays out when you think about bias in the workforce and harassment. Because benevolent sexism sounds nice, but it's really not. Benevolent sexism is actually the practice of differentiating by the sexes because you think, well, women need to be protected. Women can't do the hard jobs, so they should be given the easy work. We need to take care of women, or women are just naturally better at taking care of the home. So it sounds nice, but it isn't, and it leads to real effects in the workforce, especially when you're in an environment like in tech, where you have to fight for the hardest assignments. But what was concerning was that the majority of the young men that were interviewed and surveyed actually have young women reporting to them and are hiring them. So this plays out, and you think about what does that mean in general life? Well, if one exposure leads to benevolent sexism, what does rampant exposure mean? What do all of these images where women's bodies are being used to sell a product but has nothing to do with the product, whether it's a car or shoes or cleaning products, whatever it might be, women's bodies are the commodity that's being used, and people use the conventional wisdom that sex sells. But in the world of every product, every consumer good, sex does not have to play a role in selling those products. And what we found was that the ads didn't perform any better. They just got more clicks. But they didn't even get enough clicks. They got only 0.1% of clicks. And so you're wondering, why are so few people clicking? So the ads actually aren't better. They don't result in more transactions. They only result in a very particular segment of users who are constantly served by those kinds of ads. They may not be buying, but they're clicking. And that's the predictable click. And why I bring this up is because when you look at all the different things that we're exposed to, it actually translates into how young women form ideas about themselves. So in the study, we also found that after one exposure, women around the age of 18 to 20 had less sense of agency than before, valued how much they weighed versus how healthy they were, and were more likely to value appearance over intelligence. So we get back to what are the messages that are being sent. I started this company because I wanted to understand some of the underlying bias that's hard to measure, but in reality it isn't. You just have to try harder. And making sure that we're measuring the things that matter, not just reporting what we can measure. And changing how we measure things and taking into account effects, long-term effects. So we know from a lot of literature that young women, when they have a lower sense of agency, a sense of self, a sense of confidence, it leads to a lifetime of decisions. Issues crop up, like issues around their weight, their self-confidence that can play out into eating disorders, or less confidence in a sexual relationship. These are all actually directly correlated as long-term outcomes, and these are just indicators that tell us along the way that someone is maybe going down a path that could lead them to more exposure and risk over time. So I started doing this research because we also saw gender bias in algorithms and in technology. So I created with my 2 female co-founders, an AI company called Prizma, which changes how those algorithms work, and instead of just biasing based on what we know to be true, instead looks at a fuller picture of what drives human engagement and behavior. And I'm proud to say we're in the final stages of selling that right now, so yay! But it's a different way of looking at the world. And we did some research also on the kinds of characters that people watch on TV shows and movies. And what was interesting was that when you look at the kinds of characters that people are exposed to, let's say in primetime TV shows, women really over-indexed on being young, being overly sexual, on not being funny, and not being passionate about their work. Now, who in here is passionate about your work? Yeah. So that's not reflecting reality, right? And so one of the challenges that we have is that often entertainment is propagating really old stereotypes and a paradigm that just doesn't even exist anymore. When you look at younger women and family films, the discrepancy actually gets even bigger, and fewer women are portrayed as passionate about their work or even working. And again, skew much younger. What's interesting is you don't see that drop off with men at all. You just see it with women. So you see younger women and you think, wow, the general population is really young, aren't they? But the truth is that they're just they're disappeared. And so when you're a young woman and you're watching shows that don't have women doing things that you want to do, it actually has an effect. And many young women can internalize that to believe they have fewer options in life because they don't see anyone on the screen that reflects what they might want to do. And part of the challenge is that in terms of occupations represented, in terms of the types of careers that girls have access to, if you don't see yourself in something, it's harder to pursue it. My co-founder is a neuroscientist, and she studied human brain through fMRI imaging and looked at how people respond to different kinds of characters. And there was this interesting effect, which is that when they saw someone that they related to, it was an experiential first-person part of the brain effect. And that has major implications, because if you can imagine yourself as a scientist, then suddenly that possibility becomes real. But if you're never shown an image of a woman scientist, then you may never have that possibility occur. And it takes that much more work to open up that opportunity. I say this because I've been working in the career of STEM for over 20 years. I've been in technology. And, we're underrepresented as women and people of color. But part of the challenge is because of the way in which the career itself is represented. And when you look at the 1980s and the particular approach that they took to who is represented in films about geeks, I know you can probably name a movie or two, geeks and computers and nerds, suddenly the women disappeared. But it was actually women who invented software engineering, and women who also invented, well, they were computers, right? And so it's the disappearance that makes it particularly difficult because then younger women believe they have fewer options available to them. So this becomes really important when you think about how this plays out at a national scale. So how are we thinking about the way in which bias is addressed in, let's say, how sexual assault cases are handled, or credibility of witnesses, or whether or not a woman is willing to come forward with an issue? So earlier this year, Betsy DeVos was sued by a number of groups because she was rolling back Obama-era protections for the victims that required campuses to report and act on particular types of cases within a time frame, and also took out a lot of the teeth of the program, which is attached to Title IX. This is dangerous. This is very, very dangerous, because we already see that there are so few cases that are being prosecuted effectively as it is. And then now you're further discouraging survivors from coming forward to accuse, because it's giving more rights to the accused. And this is in this current administration. There's also issues at the state level. 20% of states teach abstinence-only education. That's crazy. And in this era, now, yes, people have the internet, but there's a lot of other things that happen on the internet. So it's not the kind of education necessarily that you would want. This is why I decided to run for office originally, because I really cared about policy that was much more comprehensive and that thought more about what are these long-term effects that maybe are unintended, that we're not even aware of, and the unconscious bias that can creep into how certain things get done and decisions get made. So my career has been one where I've focused on building great products or pursuing research, or now, hopefully, developing national policy. But if the people in this room who are educators are working with young people who are just beginning to think about their options in life, be aware that there's a lot happening subconsciously that is limiting many, especially women, especially trans women or transgender, and also people of color. Just be aware that there are these underlying, very insidious biases that get internalized and that can limit someone's belief in their ability to do more. And the one thing I cared about my entire life is around every person's potential, achieving their full potential and having the opportunity to do so. And part of that means learning in an environment free of harm, free of discrimination, free of assault. And it also means supporting people who've been through those horrible experiences and doing so in a way institutionally that protects them. Not on one-off case, but institutionally tries to right that wrong with due process and other support. Finally, when we think about education, it's also important to think about who is being represented in the education itself. Who are the figureheads, the role models, the authority figures? Because that also has an effect on whether or not someone can feel comfortable and identify with what's being taught. There was an interesting study that was done at Stanford where they showed a picture of a conference, and one had all men, one had all women, and one had both. Well, guess what? Most people wanted to go to the one with both. And it's kind of obvious. So why do we disproportionately exclude certain people, especially, I would say, women, from participation fully in the opportunities that are available? And I think that there's a lot to be said for how we educate people through a place of compassion, and by understanding that the decisions that get made, often subconsciously, play out through the rest of their lives. And so making sure that young people, young women in particular, are shown role models that are diverse, are given encouragement and support, and that we understand that there are things like messaging and images that erode your self-conscious and your ability to do more. When you know how hard the fight's going to be, it makes it that harder to do it and to really step forward to be in your full power. And that's what I really seek to help everyone, which is to be in your full power and strength to succeed. So with that, I'd love to take Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for Thank you for that, and it was very, very interesting, and thanks for the work that you're doing. You shared a lot of great information. At the very beginning, you were talking about these ads and the really detrimental effect that one exposure to men and women of being exposed to objectifying a woman in an ad can have a really substantial negative impact. How do you determine that as a result of that one exposure? Because there are so many exposures in this life that can have a negative impact on a woman's confidence or on a man's way of looking at women that they hire or work with. So I'm just curious how you were doing that research to associate it with that one exposure.
That's a great question, and we didn't find a statistically significant result in every age group. This was really prominent among young men who are early in their career. And what we did was we had a before and after, and then we had a cognitive test, which was basically a way of distracting them so that the subconscious answer came out readily. So it was basically a before and after with a task that occupied them so that when they answered, it was not a thought-through answer, it was the immediate result. So when we asked them, it was based on a very well-established battery that's been in the literature for 20 years around the definition of benevolent sexism. We also tested for hostile sexism, but we didn't find an effect. Now, for younger women, what was interesting was that the effect was such that they tend to consume more of the objectifying content once they've crossed a certain line. And that's really worrisome, because if you are having self-confidence problems, you've internalized that lack of agency, and then you consume more content that feeds it. It's a very dangerous cycle, actually. But did that answer your question about?
Yeah, thank you. So it wasn't necessarily the first exposure ever. It was an exposure, one exposure in a certain time frame.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting stuff.
Which makes you think, because of the proliferation of those images, like you think one exposure could do this, and then you think about how that propagates across the entire digital experience. That's a massive amount of exposure. We didn't test for that. We were looking for the instant. Yeah. But it would be a great follow-on piece of work. I'm Rachel Payne.
Hi, Ms. Payne. Thank you very much for that. Is this on? Hello? Yeah. So as a Latina researcher, a lot of what you're saying, you know, I've lived it, a lot of my friends have lived it, and we're starting to now have these conversations about what it means to see ourselves in academia and therefore recognize we can be in academia. But there's quite a bit of resistance at the R1s and the Ivy Leagues for this sort of dialogue. So I'm wondering, to keep it going, what sort of community partnerships have you made with people of color in academia to kind of help support this and keep it rolling when you do hit resistance?
Well, the first study we did was with the American Association of University Women, which is just very large and helped us get access to a number of other researchers. Another study we worked on was in complement to the Gina Davis Institute for Gender and Media. I'm not actively seeking out academic relationships per se, but I'd be very interested in how to do that. And one of the studies, by the way, I didn't mention, when looking at characters, found that Latinas are exactly underrepresented by the same amount that white men are overrepresented. That was another interesting finding. There are also a lot of other racial characteristics that were surprising and not at the same time, about Asian men, about, yeah, there was a whole lot there. It's a very interesting study. I think one of the keys is for people to see you in the role and for people to become those role models more publicly. I know that's probably asking a lot of everyone, but for the few people who get to that place, for you to be a person that other kids know about and see and are able to access makes it real. And I'd love to talk about partnership.
Thank you so much for that response. But yeah, I would encourage you. I'm following your career. My husband has certainly looked up, you know, what you're doing, and it's wonderful. And I would just encourage you, as you move forward and upward, to kind of keep in mind these close relationships you can have with communities of color, to maybe get some input, because often we have our issues championed by Caucasian women, and that's wonderful, but at some point the narrative shifts and it stops actually being our narrative. So if you could really try to keep those ties there, I think it would be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked on a lot of different NGOs and boards. I mean, I've done a ton of work. I'm not claiming to represent a community. I'm trying to just present the findings that were at a very particular level. But yeah, I would love that, you know. And I have done a fair amount of work all over the world with communities, in community, like, you know, and I appreciate what that means. And I definitely don't want to take the dialogue away.
Right here.
Oh, over there?
It's on.
Yes.
Hi.
Is that a question? I can't tell.
Okay. Hi. Can you hear me?
Okay. Well, anyway, the research is all available. It's free. You can just find it on our website. Oh, was there another one?
Yeah, sorry. Back here. Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So my question, I guess, was, so like relative to the current media and like Hollywood and in light of the Me Too movement and all of the recent happenings that have been going on in this space, congressionally speaking or even politically speaking, we're sort of contending with a system that fails to provide any kind of political accountability. Sometimes there's only we're contending between like political accountability and like a system that provides financial redress to victims. So I think my question is more like, moving forward in the political space, like what's your vision for creating a political system that is more responsive and supportive of people who work in Congress and people that work in the political space who are experiencing some of the things that we've talked about and that gathered here for. So I just kind of want to know what your vision is, I guess, for that moving forward.
Yeah, I was surprised when I visited the Hill and met with members of Congress. There's actually no orientation or sexual harassment training for members of Congress. Yeah, so really hard to legislate around something that there's no accountability or recourse in your workforce and work environment. I think companies have actually done more to advance that than our government, sadly. I know that there are some bills that are underway that are much more focused on both the compensation, the recourse available to survivors, but also trying to be more systematic in understanding how discrimination and harassment occurs. So I had a conversation with a congressman about sexual harassment in tech, which is, you know, not uncommon, and just the frequency with which that happens, and how hard it is to, you know, get justice. And I think part of the problem is that there's a culture that enables it. You know, there's a culture that, as long as it's allowed to believe that women are secondary, or I don't know if anyone here read the James Damore memo, but okay, so basically it was a Google engineer who said that women don't belong in tech, that they are not intelligent enough, that they bring down the intelligent quotient there, all these other things. But just by virtue of saying those things, it acts as a deterrent for more women going into tech. Because what it tells them is, you're not welcome, you don't belong, you're uninvited, and it just plays into the cycle that actually prevents them from going into tech in the first place. And there are a lot of other industries like that. And I'm sure everyone in this room probably has a story. So what I would say is that there's actually a lot of lessons to be learned about how you can create the sensitization within the culture itself to be aware. There's unconscious bias trainings. There's a lot of other things that have started to take root and are having some effect. We're not there yet. We're not there in any respect, frankly. But I do think with the Me Too movement, there's a line in the sand. There was before and now. And now you're seeing real action being taken. I think the Cosby trial that just happened, like how many lives were impacted for how many decades before anything was done? And then when we collectively said, enough, time's up, Me Too, Suddenly, the numbers were so great that they couldn't ignore it anymore, and it was a groundswell. And that we have to maintain. We have to be that continuous collective voice for everyone who is trying to get through the experience of trauma, and remember that we are all in it together and that they can't ignore it when we're that loud. And that's where I think we should speak up by contacting the representatives and making sure that those who are under investigation, we don't pay for their for their settlement fees, which is something that just happened. Hopefully we'll get all of the scandals out, then we can clean house and then put some new leadership in. And I hope it's more diverse and representative of who we are. Thank you.